blood on the pristine white marble of the cathedral wasn't supposed to be part of the wedding decor. Nor were the tears streaming down the overweight bride's face as her legs gave out. "I'm too heavy," she sobbed. Dante, a ruthless syndicate boss, simply smiled effortlessly, lifting her into his arms. White silk and imported French lace were never meant to stretch over a size 22 frame. Skylar Kensington stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her family's Gold Coast penthouse, staring at the reflection of a woman who looked like a beautifully wrapped, oversized mistake. The Ailey Saab gown rushed through 3 different tailors to accommodate her thick waist. Heavy bust and wide hips felt less like a wedding dress and more like a straitjacket. "Suck it in, Skylar, for God's sake, Eleanor," her mother snapped from the velvet chaise lounge, sipping a mimosa. "The corset has steel boning. Let it do its job. You look like a stuffed sausage, and the Moretti family is already taking a massive gamble on our reputation." Skylar bit her inner cheek so hard she tasted copper. She didn't say a word. She was accustomed to the cruelty. It was the baseline of her existence in the Kensington household. Harrison Kensington, her father, was a prominent Chicago real estate developer to the public eye, but behind closed doors, he was a degenerate gambler with a penchant for offshore embezzlement. He had borrowed $20 million from the wrong people. Specifically, he had borrowed from Dante Moretti. Dante was not a man who played by the rules of polite society. Operating out of a heavily fortified compound in Oak Brook, Dante was the undisputed head of the Chicago outfit's most violent faction. Whispers in the high society galas painted him as a ghost who left nothing but chalk outlines and gutted businesses in his wake. When Harrison defaulted, the execution order was supposed to be swift. Instead, Dante had walked into Harrison's study, tossed a dossier on the mahogany desk, and made a singular demand, a marriage alliance, to legitimize his holdings through Kensington real estate. Naturally, Harrison had immediately offered Victoria. Victoria was the golden child, a size 2 former pageant queen with razor-sharp cheekbones and a hollow heart. But Dante had bypassed Victoria's glossy headshot. He had pointed a scarred, calloused finger at a family portrait in the background, tapping directly on Skylar's face. That one Dante had commanded his voice, like gravel grinding over glass. The heavy one. "I want her." Skylar adjusted the suffocating tulle of her sleeves, trying to hide the dimples on her thick arms. Why her? The question had kept her awake for 3 straight weeks. The media had a field day when the engagement leaked. The Beast and the Beast one cruel tabloid had headlined, featuring a zoomed-in paparazzi shot of Skylar buying a coffee, her double chin prominent in the harsh morning light. "She's sweating," Victoria drawled, leaning against the doorframe in a sleek bridesmaid dress that hugged her non-existent curves. "If you sweat through the silk before you even get to Holy Name Cathedral, Dante is going to feed you to his Dobermans. I hear he likes his meat tender. Leave me alone," Victoria Skylar whispered, her voice trembling. "Just stating facts." Victoria smirked. "It's a business transaction, Penny. He bought a human shield for his PR problem. You're wide enough to catch a few bullets. Make yourself useful." Harrison burst into the room, checking his Rolex. His face was flushed with the kind of manic panic that belonged to a man who knew a sniper's crosshairs were constantly trained on the back of his neck. "Time to go. The cars are downstairs. If we are 1 minute late, Dante's enforcer Lorenzo swore he would break my kneecaps in the vestibule." He glared at Skylar, his eyes sweeping over her large figure with undisguised disgust. "Don't embarrass me. Walk straight. Try to look less massive." Skylar nodded numbly. As she gathered the heavy skirts of her dress, her thighs rubbed together underneath the layers of crinoline, a physical reminder of the space she occupied. She felt humiliated, terrified, and utterly alone. She was walking into a cage with a monster sold by a father who viewed her as livestock, judged by a world that deemed her unworthy of romance, let alone respect. The ride to the cathedral was suffocatingly silent. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the Maybach, mirroring the storm brewing in Skylar's chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a flesh cage. She knew Dante Moretti's reputation. He had allegedly dismantled a rival Russian syndicate boss with a straight razor and a pair of pliers. What would a man like that do to a bride he was forced to endure? Would he lock her away in a basement? Would he mock her naked body? The intrusive thoughts spiraled, feeding her rising panic. Holy Name Cathedral was a fortress of Gothic architecture and solemn silence, but today it felt like an execution chamber. As Skylar stood in the narthex, the massive oak doors separating her from the congregation, she could hear the low hum of voices. The guest list was a terrifying hybrid of Chicago's political elite and the most dangerous men in the Western Hemisphere. "Arm out," Harrison ordered, barely looking at her. He linked his arm through hers, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Smile. If you cry, I will personally lock you in the attic when this is over." The heavy doors swung open. The organist began to play a haunting, slow rendition of the traditional march, the chords echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Skylar stepped forward. The sheer weight of her dress, combined with the paralyzing fear in her veins, made her legs feel like lead. The moment she entered the nave, a hush fell over the pews, followed instantly by the venomous hiss of whispers. Skylar's vision blurred, but she could still see their faces. The men in sharp Italian suits, smirking, the women in designer hats, leaning into each other's ears behind gloved hands. My God, she's enormous. Did Harrison feed her to keep her quiet? I give it a week before Dante suffocates her with a pillow. The cruel remarks echoed in her ears, amplifying her anxiety. Her chest tightened, the corset tightly laced to create an illusion of an hourglass figure, dug fiercely into her ribs, restricting her airflow. She took a shallow breath, then another, but oxygen seemed to bypass her lungs. Then she looked toward the altar. Dante Moretti stood there, a towering monolith of a man in a bespoke black tuxedo. He was devastatingly handsome, but in a brutal, unforgiving way. His jawline was sharp, his dark hair slicked back, and a faint, jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. His eyes, dark as an oil slick, locked onto hers. There was no disgust in them, no mockery, only a terrifying, intense, burning focus that made the hairs on Skylar's arms stand up. Next to him stood Lorenzo, a mountain of a man with a holstered weapon, visible beneath his tailored jacket, sweeping the crowd with a predator's gaze. "Keep walking," Skylar told herself. "Just keep walking." But the room was spinning. The stained glass windows blurred into streaks of garish color. Her heart was beating entirely too fast. The whispers grew louder, merging into a roaring cacophony in her head. She was a joke, a fat, unwanted joke paraded in front of the city's most lethal predators. She was halfway down the aisle when her body finally rebelled. Her right heel caught on the heavy hem of the Elie Saab gown. With her center of gravity thrown off and her lungs screaming for air, Skylar stumbled forward. Harrison didn't try to catch her. He recoiled, dropping her arm as if she were infected. Skylar hit the marble floor hard. The sound of her impact echoed through the cavernous cathedral, followed by a collective, horrified gasp from the congregation. A sharp crack reverberated as her knee slammed into the stone, tearing the delicate silk. Laughter. Someone in the back row actually laughed. Tears of pure, unadulterated shame spilled hot and fast down Skylar's cheeks. She scrambled her thick, manicured fingers, slipping on the polished marble as she tried to push herself up. Her dress tangled around her legs, trapping her. Her corset dug into her diaphragm, and a full-blown panic attack seized her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't stand. "Get up, you stupid cow!" Harrison hissed under his breath, leaning down but offering no hand. "Get up!" She tried. She really did. But her legs were shaking too violently, her knees bruised and weak. The sheer mass of the dress and the gravity of her terror anchored her to the floor. She was a stranded whale on a marble beach, surrounded by sharks. Suddenly, heavy measured footsteps echoed down the aisle. The murmurs in the pews instantly died, replaced by a suffocating silence. The temperature in the cathedral seemed to drop 10 degrees. Skylar looked up through her tear-soaked lashes. Dante had left the altar. He was walking down the aisle, his face a mask of cold, terrifying fury. Not directed at her, but at the crowd. At Harrison. He stopped in front of her. Harrison immediately backed away, his face pale hands raised in a gesture of submission. Dante knelt gracefully, his expensive trousers brushing the cold marble. He didn't care about the dirt. He didn't care about the optics. He reached out his large, scarred hands, gently cupping Skylar's tear-streaked, flushed face. His thumbs, rough and warm, wiped away a stray tear. I can't," Skylar gasped, her chest heaving violently. She looked away, deeply ashamed of her bulk of her failure to do the one simple task required of her. "I'm sorry. I can't walk. I'm too heavy." The tears flowed freely, now ruining her professional makeup. "I'm too heavy to carry," the bride cried, her voice breaking on a sob that echoed her lifetime of insecurities. The Ruthless Mafia boss smiled. It wasn't a cruel smirk or a polite, patronizing grin. It was a genuine, devastatingly tender smile that completely altered the harsh landscape of his face. "Mia dolcezza," Dante murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated straight to her core. "You are exactly as you should be." Without a moment of hesitation, Dante slid one massive arm under her broad back and the other beneath her thick thighs. Skylar gasped, her eyes widening in shock. She braced for him to struggle to grunt under her weight, to prove to everyone watching that she was a burden. He didn't. With a smooth, powerful motion, Dante Moretti stood up, lifting Skylar entirely off the floor. He held her against his broad chest, as easily as if she weighed nothing but spun sugar and silk. Her heavy skirts cascaded over his arm, hiding his dark suit in a waterfall of white. "Put your arms around my neck," he commanded softly, his dark eyes locking onto her bewildered gaze. Trembling Skylar obeyed, wrapping her thick arms around his broad shoulders. She could smell him, an intoxicating mix of gun oil, expensive bergamot, and raw power. He held her securely, his grip firm and possessive. He wasn't straining. He was walking her down the rest of the aisle, carrying her past the stunned, silent congregation. As they passed Harrison, Dante didn't even turn his head, but his voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Lorenzo." "Yes, boss," came the immediate reply from the altar. "Cut off Kensington's left hand before the reception. He let my wife fall." Skylar gasped against Dante's neck, her heart stopping. His wife. "Don't look at them," Dante whispered into her ear, as he carried her up the steps to the altar, his breath warm against her skin. "Look at me, Skylar. Only me. They don't know who you are, but I do. I haven't forgotten the girl in the alley behind St. Jude's 3 years ago." Skylar's breath hitched. 3 years ago. The soup kitchen on the south side, the freezing rain, the man bleeding out behind the dumpsters with a bullet in his gut, whom she had dragged into her rusty sedan, pressing her oversized coat against his wound to stop the bleeding until she got him to an underground clinic, disappearing before anyone could ask her name. She stared up into the eyes of the monster of Chicago, realizing with a violent shock that her arranged marriage wasn't a punishment for her father's debt. It was a rescue mission for her. You were the man in the alley. Skylar breathed the words barely audible over the swelling organ music that signaled the end of the ceremony. Dante had carried her through the entire exchange of vows. He had placed the massive, flawless diamond ring on her trembling finger while supporting her weight against his chest. He had kissed her forehead, a brand of absolute ownership and fierce protection, before turning them toward the congregation. Heavy oak doors closed behind them as Dante carried her out of the cathedral and straight into the waiting armored limousine. Only when the doors locked and the privacy partition slid up did he gently set her down on the plush leather seat. Skylar immediately shrank back against the door, pulling the torn silk of her ruined wedding gown over her bruised knees. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. Dante reached out, pouring a glass of amber liquid from the crystal decanter and pressing it into her shaking hands. "Drink. It will settle your nerves." Skylar took a small sip, coughing, as the burn of expensive whiskey coated her throat. 3 years ago, she whispered, her voice shaking as she stared at the terrifying man sitting across from her. "You were dying behind the dumpsters. I pressed my coat to your stomach. You told me to leave before your enemies found us." "And you refused," Dante replied softly, loosening his silk tie. The brutal syndicate boss leaned back, his dark eyes tracing the curves of her flushed face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You dragged a man twice your size into a rusted Toyota, drove through a blizzard, and bullied an underground surgeon into saving my life. Then you vanished. No name, no number. Just a blood-soaked wool coat left on the waiting room chair." "I was terrified," Skylar admitted, staring at her thick fingers. "I knew who you were. Everyone in Chicago knows who Dante Moretti is. I didn't want a reward. I just didn't want you to die." Dante leaned forward, bridging the gap between them. He took the whiskey glass from her hand and set it aside, then took her hands in his. His thumbs stroked her knuckles. "It took me 2 years to track down the license plate. When I finally found out the angel who saved me was the eldest daughter of Harrison Kensington, I was enraged. Your father is a parasite, a compulsive gambler who sells his own blood for chips." Skylar flinched, looking away. "I know what he is. I know what I am to him." "You have no idea what you are," Dante corrected sharply, though his grip remained gentle. "When Harrison came to my associates, begging for a $20 million loan to cover his offshore embezzlement, I saw my opportunity. I approved the loan, knowing he would default. I orchestrated this entire debt just to back him into a corner. I demanded a marriage alliance, because I knew if I simply asked to court you, he would hide you away and push your sister forward. He is ashamed of you, Skylar. But I am not." Tears pricked Skylar's eyes. She had spent her entire life apologizing for her existence, hiding her heavy body under layers of dark clothing, absorbing the constant venomous insults from her mother and sister. To hear the most feared man in the city confess that he had orchestrated an international financial crisis just to claim her was entirely overwhelming. The limousine pulled into the heavily fortified gates of the Moretti compound in Oak Brook. The reception was being held in the grand ballroom of the estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by armed guards and high stone walls. As they entered the grand foyer, the reality of her new life crashed down on her. The guests from the cathedral had arrived, filling the room with forced laughter and tense whispers. Skylar felt the immediate burning stares of the syndicate elite. She felt her insecurities rising, threatening to drown her newly discovered courage. She was still overweight, still clumsy, still the woman who had fallen flat on her face in Holy Name Cathedral. Before she could spiral, a piercing scream echoed from the east wing. Skylar jumped, but Dante didn't even blink. He calmly placed a hand on the small of her back. "It seems Lorenzo is collecting my wedding gift from your father. You actually had his hand cut off." Skylar gasped, horrified, but strangely, not entirely devastated. "I am a man of my word, mia dolcezza," Dante stated, his voice laced with ice. "He let you fall. He mocked you. He will never use that hand to place a bet or strike you ever again." Suddenly Victoria appeared from the crowd, her face flushed with a toxic mixture of panic and furious jealousy. She wore her sleek silver bridesmaid gown like a weapon, pushing past two heavily armed guards to reach Dante. She completely ignored Skylar stepping directly into Dante's personal space. "Dante!" Victoria purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she placed a manicured hand on his broad chest. "This is madness. My father is bleeding in your medical wing over a clumsy mistake. You don't have to do this. You have the Kensington assets now. You don't need to chain yourself to a liability." She cast a sneering glance at Skylar's ripped dress and thick waist. "Annul the marriage. Take me instead. I know how to host your galas. I know how to wear the diamonds. I won't embarrass you by collapsing in the aisle." Skylar felt the familiar sting of humiliation and took a step back, ready to fade into the shadows, just as she always did when Victoria demanded the spotlight. Dante's reaction was instantaneous and violent. He grabbed Victoria by the wrist, squeezing so hard that a sharp crack echoed over the low hum of the ballroom. Victoria shrieked, dropping to her knees. "Do not ever speak to my wife in that tone." Dante snarled, his voice a demonic register that silenced the entire room. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. "You are nothing but a hollow shell of vanity. Skylar is my queen. If you look at her with disrespect again, I will have Lorenzo remove your tongue and serve it to my hounds." Dante shoved Victoria away, leaving her weeping and clutching her bruised wrist on the polished floor. He turned to Skylar, offering his arm. "Shall we dance, Mrs. Moretti?" The ballroom remained suffocatingly quiet as Dante led Skylar to the center of the dance floor. The orchestra frantically began playing a slow waltz. Skylar moved rigidly, entirely hyper-aware of the hundreds of eyes analyzing her broad shoulders and thick thighs. But Dante held her close, his hand resting firmly on her hip, guiding her with surprising grace. "They are staring," Skylar whispered, her face burning. "Let them stare," Dante replied, spinning her gently. "They are looking at the woman who holds my life in her hands. They are looking at the new sovereign of the outfit." But the peaceful moment was an illusion. In the shadowy corners of the room, treason was brewing. Giovanni, one of Dante's oldest and most ruthless capos, had been simmering with rage for months. Giovanni believed that Dante's obsession with finding the girl from the alley had made him weak. Giovanni had conspired with Harrison Kensington, feeding the desperate father false hopes of usurping Dante's throne from the inside. Halfway through the waltz, the massive chandelier above the ballroom flickered and died. Plunged into sudden darkness, the room erupted into chaos. Gunfire shattered the tall glass windows. Skylar screamed as Dante immediately tackled her to the ground, shielding her heavy body with his own. Glass rained down on them like deadly hail. "Lorenzo!" Dante roared over the deafening sound of automatic weapons. "South doors are breached, boss!" Lorenzo shouted from the darkness, returning fire. "It's Giovanni's men! They disabled the backup generators." Dante pulled Skylar up behind a massive marble pillar. He drew a sleek black firearm from his tuxedo jacket. Blood trickled down his cheek from a shattered piece of glass, making his facial scar look even more menacing. "Stay here," he ordered Skylar. "Do not move." But Skylar didn't cower. As the adrenaline surged through her veins, a strange, undeniable clarity washed over her. She had spent weeks confined to her room before the wedding, terrified of her future. To cope with her anxiety, she had obsessively studied the architectural blueprints of the Moretti compound, trying to map out her new prison. She knew exactly where they were. "Dante, wait." Skylar grabbed his arm. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. "The servant corridors. Giovanni's men are coming through the south, trying to pin you against the terrace. But there is a hidden catering corridor right behind that tapestry." She pointed to a massive woven rug hanging on the east wall. "It leads directly to the security armory on the second floor, flanking the south doors. You can get above them." Dante looked at her, his dark eyes wide with genuine astonishment. Then a wicked, proud smile spread across his face. "Lorenzo, east wall tapestry, move," Dante commanded. He didn't leave Skylar behind. He grabbed her hand, pulling her along as they sprinted through the darkness, dodging bullets that chewed through the marble pillars. Skylar's lungs burned, and her heavy dress slowed her down, but she refused to fall this time. She pushed through the pain, ripping the heavy crinoline skirt away with her free hand to free her legs. They crashed through the hidden door, just as Giovanni's mercenaries flooded the ballroom. Skylar led them up the narrow, pitch-black staircase, her memory serving as their only map. She navigated the winding servant halls, flawlessly leading Dante and Lorenzo directly to the armory overlook. From the balcony above, Dante and Lorenzo had a perfect tactical advantage. Within 3 minutes, the ambush was entirely neutralized. Giovanni's men were decimated. Giovanni himself was dragged up the stairs by Lorenzo, bleeding from a shoulder wound, coughing up blood onto the Persian rugs. Dante stood over the traitor, his face an emotionless mask of pure violence. "You went soft, Dante," Giovanni spat, clutching his chest. "You burned millions to buy a fat, useless pig from a degenerate gambler. You brought weakness into this house." Dante raised his gun, pointing it directly at the spot between Giovanni's eyes. But before he pulled the trigger, Dante looked at Skylar. She stood there, breathing heavily, her dress torn to shreds, covered in dust and glass. She was not the delicate, fragile Mafia wives that society expected. She was large, fiercely intelligent, and she had just saved the syndicate. She looked magnificent. "She is not a weakness," Dante said coldly. "She is the architect of your demise." A single shot rang out, and Giovanni slumped to the floor, lifeless. The silence that followed was heavy. The compound security forces flooded the halls, securing the perimeter and cleaning up the carnage. Dante handed his weapon to Lorenzo and walked slowly toward Skylar. She braced herself, the adrenaline suddenly draining from her system, leaving her trembling. She looked down at her ruined dress, her wide hips exposed, her thick arms bruised from the escape. The old insecurities rushed back, but Dante didn't see flaws. He knelt before her, just as he had in the cathedral, ignoring the blood and debris. He took her shaking hands and pressed them to his lips. "For 3 years I chased a ghost," Dante murmured, looking up at her with profound reverence. "I built my empire higher, just so I could drag you up to the throne with me. You saved my life in an alley, Skylar. And tonight, you saved my empire. You are my queen. My brilliant, beautiful queen. And I will burn this city to the ground before I ever let anyone make you feel small again." Skylar looked down at the ruthless monster of Chicago, the man who had orchestrated a financial collapse just to find her, the man who looked at her heavy body and saw only strength. The tears that fell from her eyes were no longer tears of shame. They were tears of absolute liberation. She was too heavy to carry the burdens of her past, but she was exactly the right size to rule. If you found yourself captivated by Skylar and Dante's thrilling journey from a cruel arrangement to a powerful mafia empire, make sure to hit that like button. We release heart-pounding, dramatic romance stories just like this one every single week. Share this video with your fellow romance lovers who appreciate a fierce, unconventional bride and a ruthless boss who treats her like a queen. Subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss an update.